Hello, this is Pacific Media from the Pacific Coast of Canada. All candidates sincerely offer to change the political system. But to do that, they really want your endorsement of political power to them, so they can make all the political decisions for you and me. We, the citizens, have to ask ourselves, are we really incapable of legislating our own policies? If that is our belief, then we will continue to give our political power to legislate to political representatives. On the other hand, if we realize that we, the citizens, can legislate our own rules of governance, we will start building a direct democracy system. This is Professor James Lasson from UBIC, Department of Political Science. My question is, how democratic is our political system, which resides on a monarchy?
Right. I think this aspect of our Constitution sometimes puzzles people, and it becomes puzzling all the more, not just for people who are Republicans out of conviction, but also from people who don't have, as part of their growing up, any positive memories of the British constitutional history. So the usual defense that you'll get of how our system works under a monarch is that the Queen is Queen under sufferance from us.
I don't understand that.
Under sufferance means she's Queen as long as we want her to be Queen.
The Governor General really is more than just an empty figurehead who merely rubber stamps the decisions of Parliament. What he has is authority granted to him by King George VI in 1947 through the letters patent establishing the office of the Governor General of Canada. And what those letters patent say is that, among other things, the Governor General may remove from office anyone for cause without qualification.
So you're saying that legally, the Governor General has the authority to fire the Prime Minister?
Not legally, constitutionally.
And even as early as there was something called the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England. The English Bill of Rights is imposed on the King and Queen, the new King and Queen, and they're told they can govern as long as they respect these rights. And so the argument from inside this system is that we respect the Queen not just because she's Queen, but because her predecessors agreed to growing liberties on the part of her subjects. So we don't have the kind of top-down kind of monarchy that the czars had or things like that. And the only thing we're asked to remember is that, at least within England, the Queen conceded powers, or the kings before her. And so now we're acknowledging her, the story is we're also acknowledging that she has very little power and we're really driving policy.
Question one, do we have democracy in Canada?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Now, the long answer is there are many types of democracy. You have the democracy from the Athenians, where they, in a way, call direct democracy because everybody would participate. But when you look closer to that type of direct democracy, you find that everybody was about 10% of the population, because there were slaves and there were women and there were people that did not own property, so they were not allowed to participate in that great direct democracy. So the idea of direct democracy was wonderful, but it wasn't practice, really.
The type of democracy we have here, we say it's influenced by corporate financing,
Oh,
specifically on elections.
Well, there are ways of shifting the balance of power between the broad base of the population and centers of power and influence like corporations.
Well, we are very close to elections, and on elections day, practicing this representative democracy, what we do is we go to the ballot box and we basically legally authorize a few people to make all the legislation for us. In other words, on election day, what we do is actually we divest ourselves from the responsibility of making political decisions. So we call that democracy. In fact, it's giving up of democracy.
Yeah. We spend 2 minutes in a box putting an X on a piece of paper, and then for some reason the people we elect seem to think they work for somebody else, and they completely ignore us.
What do you think about this disconnection? If you run a poll and the majority of Canadians say Israel is an apartheid state and therefore we shouldn't support it,
Right.
Yet our government and all the political parties are supporting it. Do you see a disconnection there between our political parties, not just the leaders, but in general the parties and the population of Canada?
Well, again, the problem is the Israel lobby has its hooks into all political parties. Our entire political system is so antiquated and so corrupt that it does not even pass the basic means test of a democracy. Israelis control through, not directly, but through a lot of very sympathetic people, they control a lot of the media coverage of Canada to an obscene degree, in fact. They control a lot of the money that goes into political campaigns.
It's possible to have campaign finance laws that are weak, that allow the dollars to talk more than the votes. And it's possible to have rules that are pretty strict. Quebec's one of the better provinces in this country in terms of restricting the role of money.
The point of the press is not to report on the Middle East, it's there to prop up a pre-established position. And Stephen Harper is fully supportive of this because he knows that it's support of Israel, corporations, arms dealers, oil companies. These are the people who put him in power. This is his true constituency. And this is why he does not really care what the Canadian public thinks, because he is not a government of the people, he is a government of plutocrats.
But if we roll the camera back a bit into the 18th and 19th centuries, we have to remember that the whole foundations of our democracy start from the standpoint that the state doesn't get to interfere in certain parts of our lives. And one of the parts that was accepted from the get-go was the distribution of private property that generates the class differences in a society. And because we started from those premises, we have to work really hard to offset the influence of, the power imbalances that go with money.
So that's one of the concerns that we have with representative democracy, and that politicians will tell you that, they're going to do this and they're going to do that. They choose a lot of words that will make us believe that they're in fact representing us, when in fact, once they get elected, they have their own agenda, which is not necessarily the same that they were given to us, the voters. They not only have their own agenda, but also they are dependent on the sponsors of their electoral campaign. So if the Chamber of Commerce or some big business sponsors them, gives them money, they're going to have to please and work for those sponsors, otherwise they won't get the money next time around.
So that is a flaw in our system?
Well, it sure is if you think that money influences politics.
Cabinet
ministers, which are selected by the premier.
Yeah.
So the premier becomes more or less like a king or a queen. And they have the power. A lot of MLAs that go to parliament, they just follow the whips.
The problem with crown revenues is that the person who pays the piper plays the tune, gets to call the tune, right? The person who pays the piper gets to call the tune. And if you rely too much on revenues that don't come from the mass of the population, the government has less and less interest in what the mass of the population has to say. So if you don't want to pay taxes, remember that that is your one guarantee that the government has to listen to you.
Do you think that in Canada we could have a more direct democracy where we, the citizens, become the legislators, and instead of giving power to somebody else to legislate, we could legislate by referendum? A lot of it's done in Switzerland, for instance, where main legislation is treated by referendum, and the parliamentarians are there just to rubber stamp what the people want. Here is the other way around.
Yes, it
The
is.
politicians make decisions, and we sometimes agree, sometimes don't agree.
But in Canada, that would not work.
Why direct democracy has not been adopted? You know, if it's so good, as I'm telling you, it's so good, why is that people are not paying attention?
Most Canadians do not want to be bothered with the affairs of state and couldn't care less. In the last election, I was appalled to find out that 50% of people surveyed in a CTV poll said they voted for a majority Harper government because they were tired of going to the polls to vote. So we have a country here of sheeple, not of citizens. And the people here would rather devolve their authority to other people to make decisions for them so they can get on with the so-called more important business of making money, enjoying life, and buying more creature comforts. Politically, we don't have the maturity or the interest to vote in referenda on all matters of public policy. We have to evolve beyond democracy into some other form of government, which I don't quite know what that would be yet. But
all candidates sincerely offer to change the political system. But to do that, they really want your endorsement of political power to them, so they can make all the political decisions for you and me. We, the citizens, have to ask ourselves, are we really incapable of legislating our own policies? If that is our belief, then we will continue to give our political power to legislate to political representatives. On the other hand, if we realize that we, the citizens, can legislate our own rules of governance, we will start building a direct democracy system. Do you think people are ready for it? Or some people think that people don't really know and it's better to just let you make all the decisions. What do you think?
You know, we've had this conversation before on a number of occasions, and I've discussed this matter with constituents. And generally, the sense I get is that most of my constituents prefer a representative democracy.
And a lot of people feel that they don't want to be asked about everything. We pay MLA salaries for a reason. They should do a job. And that job is being somebody who informs themselves and consults with citizens.
People are busy in their own lives and people don't know what as much as the MLAs do. So what do you think? Are people ready for direct democracy?
I believe people are more than ready to be more engaged than they are now. And I think it's more the political systems and the politicians who have to catch up to the people, and not the people catch up to the politicians.
Are people really ready, or some people think people don't know what they want?
I'm not sure it's an either or. I think that many of us don't know what we want, but we do want to participate. I think we've seen evidence of that, the Blue Bridge in Victoria, the HST, where people felt that they wanted a say in what governments were going to do. And so, yes, I do think people are ready. I think they want to. And I think they're just waiting for some sort of an invitation that makes it easy for them to participate.
So they'll say we're going to go out and consult, but they take an answer out to consult on.
Yeah.
I'd like to see governments go in with the question. Here's the challenge that we face in society today. Let's look at all the solutions that might be out there. That's true engagement. That's real engagement for the public. And I think we've got structures in the legislature that haven't been used for the last number of years that could be utilized. We have standing committees, for example, in the legislature. They're already existing. They have members from all political parties in the legislature on them. You could actually send them out to the communities to consult.
You remember the consultation, they called it the conversation on health.
Yes.
There was a consultation, but what was the end result of that?
It was a report that sat on the shelf.
Okay. And that was given by a former leader of the Liberal Party some time ago. Young people perhaps don't recognize his name as Gordon Gibson.
Ah, yes.
And he came up and he said, the problem, literally he says, change will not happen easily because the gatekeepers, meaning the MLAs, with the power to make political change are the same people who would lose their political power if change was to happen. So if you're sitting in power and say, I have the power of 20,000 votes, 20,000 people gave me the power legally to make decisions. Why do I want direct democracy? Means my decision-making power will be reduced to the vote of one. You realize that the more people get the right to make decisions, the less power you have as an elected MLA. Because right now you have all the power to make the decisions on behalf of all your constituents. If there is more referendums, then you lose some power.
Sure.
Are you ready to give some of that power to the people?
And I don't think that and I think that for many politicians, they are not unhappy about that decision at all. I mean, I look at the one referendum that we had in British Columbia on the HST, which was a citizen-driven initiative, remarkably successful, more successful than I ever thought it would be, to get to referendum and then to in fact be successful at what's a pretty high threshold to be successful. And that worked. And I'll tell you, for a lot of politicians, that was kind of a bit of a relief because they didn't have to make the decision anymore because the decision was made for them. So I don't think politicians worry about giving that up so much. Cabinets might, governments might.
But do you think that the more people decide, the less power you have as an MLA to make decisions?
Well, I would
are you afraid of losing that power?
I'm not the least afraid of it. I'm not the least afraid of it. In fact, I think you make better decisions when you include people who are going to be impacted by the decision.
Now, how will you verify that new or old legislation is in fact the will of the majority of people? If you don't use referenda, initiative, and plebiscites, how would you find out that the majority of people want or don't want certain legislation?
I'm not comfortable with a majority.
Okay.
What I'm comfortable with is finding consensus. A majority means 50% plus one.
How do you quantify the will of the people?
That is a difficult question, and until the internet became widespread, it was almost impossible to do that.
I think we have to find better ways to give them opportunities to be involved, not at the end, because often what I see governments doing is they involve the public when they already have an answer. So they'll say we're going to go out and consult, but they take an answer out to consult on.
Yeah.
You know, in Iceland, since they've had their financial crisis, they've been reaching out to the people of Iceland, and granted it's only 600,000 people, but every time legislation is coming to their parliament now, they go out to the people and using social media and other means say, what do you think? And people there are hungry to get involved, and I think we would find the same thing in this area.
Hello, this is Pacific.ca from the Pacific coast of Canada. Today we present segments from the second reading of the South Coast Transportation Act 2014. The current government proposes the introduction of a referendum to the financing of public transportation. Politicians on the opposition believe that the referendum is being misused as a delay tactic to deflect the government's responsibility to adequately fund public transportation. Apart from the potential misuse of referendum, direct democracy by referendum has been well utilized and supported recently in BC by a significant number of citizens.
And that commitment is this: if the mayors of Metro Vancouver are asking the people of the region to pay new taxes or fees for transit and transportation expansion, then the electors must have a say in that decision. This is a commitment that government made in the last election. It is a commitment that citizens supported.
Any increase in funding for TransLink to enhance service, to build new infrastructure, or even to keep up with a growing population, even to provide the current level of service, would have to go to a referendum. The Mayor of Vancouver called it ridiculous, and the Chair of the Mayor's Council, the Mayor of North Vancouver District, said it's clearly a deflection of the province's responsibility.
This piece of legislation is probably the most democratic process for the people of Metro Vancouver that we could have. And Madam Speaker, I am somewhat amazed that members opposite don't want to give voters a chance to have a specific voice on both shaping the future of the region and how that is going to be funded.
Thank the Minister and recognize a member from North Island.
To devolve the question of tax policy to referenda really does take away the authority of elected bodies. It's just saying, you know, it goes to every time, if you have to go to the people every time you want to make a tax increase, you have to start questioning why you have elected bodies in place.
Honourable Speaker, we have opposed this referendum from day one. Metro Vancouver deserves better.
To establish this as law, to entrench referenda for every time that the TransLink mayors need to raise money is short-sighted and simply bad economic and social policy. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I believe this is a great way to go for, in this case, a direct democracy, because it's a way for the mayors to put forward their 30 years of vision regarding strategy and 10-year funding formula.
This bill not only calls for a referendum now, it calls for perpetual referenda for any increase in funding for services, transit services, new infrastructure, increased number of buses on existing routes, any increase in service that isn't funded by the first referendum will have to go to a future referendum under this legislation. Honourable Speaker, why on earth the Transportation Minister would take a bad idea and write it into legislation in perpetuity is beyond me, but that, among other reasons, is why this side of the House will stand with the mayors and councillors of the Metro Vancouver region and oppose this legislation, oppose this referendum, and oppose future referenda, because it is a bad idea, it's an unfair idea, and it will hurt the region and the economy of British Columbia, as well as the people who depend on this government for leadership, leadership that we are not seeing. Thank you very much.
I also would like to point out this is an important issue for direct democracy. In many countries, of course, they go to vote almost every now and then, very short interval to make policy, local policy in terms of casting a vote to make decisions on how to proceed with policies in a local level. I think in many countries in Europe, they use that kind of more direct democracy quite frequently.
So here we go. Now we have this pathetic idea of having a referendum which has a good chance of failing.
Well, the problem is, what happens when the referendum says no? What if it says no?
Referenda are very powerful tools with the capacity for great good and the potential for not so good. This is why the management of this process is extremely important.
But given the circumstances that we didn't have before technology that we do have now, say 200 years ago there was no computers, no the communication technology advances that we have now. So it was difficult for people to, for politicians to get an opinion from everybody else. So it was perhaps the best type of democracy to have representation. You have to go by horse from Prince George to here to make your opinion known. So even 50 years ago it was still difficult. But since the 70s, 80s, 90s, we have internet, we have computers, we have this new technology where we can participate, you see? So the computer technology has actually changed the possibilities for people to participate. So if we have these new possibilities, then direct democracy through referendum and plebiscites is possible.
So what you would like to see is direct democracy, where on issues the public, the citizens vote, and therefore everybody knows what people want, and when the majority wants this, the politicians will do this.
Yeah, all right. As elections, one of those referendums, when you say, doesn't matter how loud you are, doesn't matter how much advertising you make, people go and vote.
They
so
do, but there are also many people.
Referendum?
It is a true referendum.
Keith Archer, the Chief Electoral Officer of BC, speaks about the recently announced independent committee to study voting over the internet. Although electoral reform is not limited to voting on the internet, it is one of the possibilities of modernizing the electoral system.
At the end of August of 2011, Elections BC published a discussion paper on internet voting. The purpose of the paper was to begin to engage in discussions about the use of internet voting and to identify some of the challenges and opportunities that arise in adopting an internet voting solution in any jurisdiction.
I have more liberty to speak freely than Keith did, because I held the job that Keith did at one time, and now I'm not beholden to any strictures associated with being absolutely neutral in all opinions. I really do believe that internet voting is the future, but I also think that it needs to be moved towards carefully, deliberately, and with healthy public debate in the process.